A taxi rank outside Johannesburg killed at least 10 people this morning. It happened just 24 hours before polling opens in South Africa's first all-race elections. The blast follows yesterday's car bombing near the African National Congress headquarters in Johannesburg, in which 9 people died. It's thought the bombs were aimed at black voters by white extremists opposed to the elections.
Another murderous morning on South Africa's troubled road to democracy. This is the result of the largest explosion in a Johannesburg suburb, the wreckage of a minibus taxi sent flying into the trees. The bomb had been placed to cause maximum carnage, deliberately targeting black commuters standing at the taxi rank. More than 2 hours after the blast, bodies were still being recovered from the wreckage of nearby shops and offices. Again, no claims of responsibility, but white right-wing extremists are suspected. Even the police were shocked by the devastation.
We can only but condemn a senseless explosion like this, but I can only call on the people to please not carry on with senseless killings like this. We need to have a peaceful election.
What's emerging is a terror campaign of murder and intimidation worse than anything expected by the security forces. A campaign designed to throw South Africa into chaos on the eve of historic elections. In hospitals around Johannesburg, scores of people are now being treated for injuries sustained in 24 hours of what appears to be racist terror. In Cape Town, the cabinet met in urgent session this morning, and President de Klerk had this to say.
I would like to assure the public that they will be effectively protected when they go to vote.
You're not going to allow the right wing to derail this election?
No, we're not going to allow the right wing or anybody else to delay this election.
And on the streets around the scene of this morning's blast, there was a resilient tone.
We want to ask our people to remain calm. The democratic process must go ahead. There's no doubt about that. And we hope that such things will not happen in future.
We are prepared really to vote and see what's the next. Because we can't really stop now. If we fight, we must fight, and we know we will win one day.
The other bombs that exploded around the country caused only minor injuries and damage, but security forces now remain on full alert for more. Mark Austin, ITN, Johannesburg.
Well, our Africa correspondent Mark Austin joins us live now from Johannesburg. Mark, are there any clues as to who might be behind these attacks?
Well, I think the speculation now is leaning very heavily towards the white right wing. After all, it was just this sort of terror campaign that they were threatening. They want to disrupt these elections. They don't want the elections to go ahead. And this morning, the targets appeared to be of racist intent, black taxi ranks, and designed to cause, as I say, maximum carnage. There is also a suggestion that they were so sophisticated and so advanced to these explosions that there could also be rogue elements of the security forces involved. And they have a history of being involved in fairly murky business like this.
So is the country braced for further attacks?
Well, I think the pattern seems to be emerging that there will be further attacks. But I think the fear is that this is going to develop into an IRA-style campaign where you have a small but very well-organised group of activists intent on causing damage, intent on disrupting these elections, but intent also on maintaining this terror campaign over months and even years. And that is the fear confronting South Africa today.
And how serious a threat do you judge these attacks to be to the elections?
Well, I think in terms of intimidation, they're already succeeding. I think a number of blacks will be finding this very intimidating indeed. And they're also vowing now to target polling stations. And that, of course, could have a dramatic effect on people intending to vote in the next few days.
Thank you, Mark.
Today, Nelson Mandela stands on the eve of ushering in a new era as South Africa's first black president. But 33 years ago, he was an outlawed political agitator in the apartheid state. In 1961, ITN tracked Nelson Mandela down to a secret hideout in Johannesburg. There, he outlined the views which led to 25 years in jail and now to the brink of power.
Nelson Mandela's first warning to the world of the armed struggle which has engulfed South Africa for decades came in this exclusive ITN interview. It was in 1961 when the young lawyer was tracked down by reporter Brian Widlake.
The police were hunting for him at the time, but African nationalists had arranged for me to meet him at his hideout. He is still underground.
The Africans want the franchise, on the basis of one man, one vote. They want political independence. There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
He had a magnetic, I think, presence. And you always felt, I think, about Mandela, whatever he was saying, that he was a man who meant business. And of course, towards the end of that interview, you realized that he did mean business because he was really hinting at what was to come, which was going to be a lot of violence, and indeed there was a lot of violence.
And as the violence increased, it led to the inevitable arrest of Mandela, charged with treason, sentenced to life imprisonment. 20 years of his jail term was spent on Robben Island. His release in 1990, aged 72, allowed the extraordinary transition from political prisoner to statesman of the ANC. Even before his exile more than 30 years ago, commentators like ITN's Brian Widlake were predicting that Mandela would come to power. The only question was when.
It will take time because the African in South Africa is not yet organized in any political sense. But whatever the most pessimistic critics may forecast, it will be the voices of people like Mandela which will have the final say in the future of this republic.
Police say they're questioning a suspect about the series of bombings which have taken place in the past 2 days. 10 people were killed this morning as a bomb ripped through a taxi queue at Germiston on the outskirts of Johannesburg. It followed yesterday's explosion near the ANC offices in the city, in which 9 people died. Polling stations across the country have also been targeted. White extremists opposed to the all-race elections are being blamed, but no organisation has admitted carrying out the attacks.
The explosion was so powerful that it blew cars into the trees. It tore through a rank used by the minibus taxis which ferry black people in from townships to Germiston, just outside Johannesburg. Police said the bomb was left in the back of a trailer. They estimated it weighed 200 pounds. The security forces did what they could to collect the remains of the victims, to count the dead and the wounded.
We have at this stage 10 confirmed deaths and 36 wounded.
Forensic scientists are trying to link this attack with all the others. The police are investigating reports that 2 white men were seen running away just before the bomb went off. No group has said that it did it, but the suspicion is that white right-wing extremists are responsible.
This is looking like a well-organized terrorist campaign run by ruthless people who have no hesitation in planting bombs where they can do most harm to civilians.
Black onlookers in Germiston said the attacks wouldn't stop them voting for the first time.
Oh, no, that is the last thing. That is the last thing. We are going for election, don't worry.
Elsewhere in South Africa, overnight and this morning, other bombs damaged 4 polling stations. Nobody was hurt in the attacks, but it's clear the intention is to disrupt this country's first democratic elections.
We're not going to allow the right wing or anybody else to delay this election, and we have achieved through negotiation now really almost full inclusiveness. We're now dealing with small handfuls of radicals.
Nelson Mandela has been visiting victims of yesterday's car bomb in Johannesburg, telling them not to lose heart. They will be able to vote. Ballot papers will be brought to their hospital beds.
Don't lose the hope. We go to vote.
Outside, Mr. Mandela appealed for South Africans of all races to stay calm.
As tragic as this violence has been, especially because a number of people have died, as tragic as that is, I want you to look to the future with hope and confidence.
He told them not to fear the forces of chaos. They could never destroy the dream of peace and racial harmony in the new South Africa. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Johannesburg.
Well, the strongest political opposition to the elections comes from the white right-wing extremist groups. And although they deny they planted today's or yesterday's bombs, they've certainly been talking the language of violence.
The AWB has taken over the rugby ground in the small right-wing Afrikaner town of Brits, an hour's drive from Johannesburg. AWB stands for Afrikaner Resistance Movement. But although its followers are anticipating bloodshed and revolution, today is a family day out. A day to show off your uniform and your weaponry. When the AWB chaplain leads the crowd in prayer, he too feels the need to have a weapon handy. Like most such movements, the AWB is the creation of one man, Eugene Terblanche. He built it up, but after 3 of its men were killed in Bophuthatswana a couple of months ago, its fortunes have slumped badly. Today, scarcely 300 people have turned out to hear him. The small size of the crowd is the clearest indication of the way the fortunes of the AWB have slumped since Bophuthatswana. A few months ago, there'd have been a big turnout here. Not anymore. Still, the people who have turned up are enthusiastic. Terblanche trained as an actor. He speaks well in Afrikaans and he knows how to stir up a crowd. What he wants is to hint at the possibility of causing violence without leaving himself or the AWB open to legal action.
Chaos and war is at the door, my friend. You are not heading for peace and prosperity after this election, or even next week. You are on your way to chaos.
The threat is there, all right, but it's not quite made explicit. That's a common trait in the AWB.
Please, we asked you nice. You guys had your press conference, it's over. What's over? The press conference, no more photos of the leader, please. You guys want anything, you can go to the front. We asked you guys nicely.
As the thinnish crowd moves off, a band starts blaring out. Under the noise, I tried to get Terblanche to be more specific about the threat of violence.
All I'm telling you is that I don't think anybody is in the position to stop right-wingers, to resist this unlawful election.
Resist with violence?
What? Yes, yes, naturally, yes.
Whoever carried out the latest bombings, Terblanche wants to give the impression that the AWB is still a force to be reckoned with, despite its loss of support. John Simpson, BBC News, Brits.
Good evening from South Africa, where there have been more explosions tonight on the eve of the country's first all-race election. Police say the most serious was a bomb thrown through the window of a cafe in a black area north of Pretoria. 2 people are reported dead, at least 8 seriously injured. Earlier today, a car bomb containing more than 200 pounds of explosives ripped through a taxi rank used by black commuters. It happened in the morning rush hour, killing 10 people and injuring at least 36 others. Police say they have a suspect, but have not confirmed reports that he's from a right-wing extremist group intent on disrupting the elections that begin tomorrow. Yesterday, 9 people were killed and more than 100 injured by a car bomb in central Johannesburg. This morning's explosion happened at Germiston, on the outskirts of the city. There have been smaller bombs across the whole country, outside polling stations, municipal buildings and near electricity pylons that haven't caused any casualties.
The explosion was so powerful that it blew cars into the trees. It tore through a rank used by the minibus taxis which ferry black people in from townships to Germiston, just outside Johannesburg. Police said the bomb was left in the back of a trailer. They estimated it weighed 200 pounds. The security forces did what they could to collect the remains of the victims, to count the dead and the wounded.
We have at this stage 10 confirmed deaths and 36 wounded.
Forensic scientists are trying to link this attack with all the others. The police are investigating reports that 2 white men were seen running away just before the bomb went off. No group has said that it did it, but the suspicion is that right-wing whites are responsible, extremists who are against majority rule. Black onlookers in Germiston said the attacks wouldn't stop them voting for the first time.
Oh, no, that's the last thing. That is the last thing. We are going for election, don't worry.
Other bombs damaged 4 polling stations. No one was hurt in those attacks, but it's clear that somebody is trying to wreck South Africa's first democratic elections.
This is looking like a well-organized terrorist campaign run by ruthless people who have no hesitation in planting bombs where they can do most harm to civilians.
The AWB, the Afrikaner Resistance Movement, had threatened to disrupt the elections, but it denies its men are the bombers. Support for it has dwindled away since more respectable Afrikaner nationalists said they'd take part in the poll. Only the true believers come to AWB rallies now, but they are the hardliners.
Chaos and war is is at the door, my friend. You are not heading for peace and prosperity after this election, or even next week. You are on your way to chaos.
This is the area.
The objective is the Volksstaat, a homeland for Afrikaners. Consistently, men like Frans Juster, who spoke to the BBC a week ago, have said the alternative is war.
We are preparing for war at this moment. We don't want war. Nobody wants war. Everybody in the world wants peace. But there's a little verse in the Bible that says, if you want peace, you must prepare for war.
In Cape Town today, President de Klerk, dismissed as a traitor by the hard right, has been presiding over the last session of the old parliament. He said no extremist would kill democracy.
We're not going to allow the right wing or anybody else to delay this election, and we have achieved through negotiation now really almost full inclusiveness. We're now dealing with small handfuls of radicals.
In Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela appealed for South Africans of all races to stay calm.
As tragic as this violence has been, especially because a number of people have died, as tragic as that is, I want you to look to the future with hope and confidence.
He told them not to fear the forces of chaos. They could never destroy the dream of peace and racial harmony in the new South Africa. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Johannesburg.
Correspondent Fergal Keane is at the scene of tonight's explosion now. Fergal, what more do you know?
We're told that 2 people have been killed, 9 seriously injured, and some of them may die later on tonight, and 13 others suffering from less serious injuries. As I'm talking to you, police are now moving through the rubble of the building, trying to find out if there are in fact more people trapped inside there. They say 2 white men came up here, threw an explosive device, and then ran away. They also say there have been 30 bomb scares in Pretoria tonight. That's an indication of the chaos the right wing is intent on causing.
Fergal, thanks. Over the next 3 days, 22 million people in South Africa will be eligible to vote in the country's first all-race elections. 70% of those are blacks voting for the first time. Voters get 2 ballot papers to elect 400 MPs to a National Assembly, 200 to be allocated according to the share of the votes won by each party nationwide, the other 200 split between 9 provinces, divided between the parties according to their share of the vote in that province. The president, almost certainly Nelson Mandela, is nominated by the party with the highest number of votes. Executive vice presidents, one expected to be Thabo Mbeki from the ANC, the other likely to be the current president, F.W. de Klerk, will be designated to those parties with more than 80 seats in the Assembly. The ANC is expected to win the national election and in most of the regions. But because there are 2 votes, some provinces may end up being run by other parties. One is the Western Cape, where the white man first set foot in South Africa. Here, the mixed-race coloured population are in the majority and seem to be turning their backs on the ANC in favour of the ruling National Party. Norman Peterson is a legacy of that first meeting of white and black on the shores of Table Bay 342 years ago. He's coloured, descended from some snatched union between slave master and slave centuries past. You can still see the remnants of the bitter almond hedge that the first Dutch commander planted to keep the Hottentots and his settlers apart. It didn't work, then or later. Today there are 3 million coloureds, most still in the Cape, emerging from the long humiliation of apartheid. Whites systematically stripped them of their vote, their rights and their fragile sense of identity. Their very existence was implicitly declared a crime by the Immorality Act. District 6 was their historic home, a vulgar but vital melting pot in the centre of Cape Town. 60,000 of them lived here, but the government declared it white and then bulldozed it flat. This is where they are now, pushed out into dusty townships on the Cape Flats, a halfway house for halfway people, and they're worried they're going to lose that. The blacks are flooding into the Cape, now the barriers of apartheid have come down. Thousands of shacks lapping up to the coloured settlements. Blacks with political power now, threatening to take away what little they've got.
They're telling you, listen, you must drive carefully with this car, because after the election, this car is going to belong to me. Or you must look very good after this house that you stays in. After the election, this house is going to belong to me.
South Africa's meant to be moving into a non-racial future where black, white and coloured will be free and equal. Yet it's one of the fascinating paradoxes of this election that just at the moment the world sees as the liberation of South Africa, the coloured people are siding with those who oppressed them for so long. Thousands of them packed out the National Party's final rally, yelling for F.W. de Klerk, whose wife once memorably described them as non-people. The election in the Cape will be decided by the coloureds, who outnumber blacks and whites put together. Polls suggest 60% of them will vote for the National Party and make this man, Hennis Kriel, the once reviled Law and Order Minister, provincial premier.
We've apologised for the mistakes of the past, and they've accepted that apology. And our policy is a fair one based on the principle of justice. Marvellous, isn't it?
Coloureds prefer the white devil they know to the black devil they fear.
We coloured, we have got a birth idea. They must go back to where they came from.
The ANC's campaign here seems to have evaporated. Their candidate, Dr. Alan Boesak, a famous coloured anti-apartheid campaigner of the 80s, is personally discredited by scandal. His party is demoralised by polls that give him only 4% of his people's vote. He spent the weekend at funerals, not campaigning.
For me, it will be a betrayal, but not a personal betrayal. It will be our people turning our back on what was best in our tradition and our history. And I think that is why I'm saying they are going to be the most pathetic of human beings immediately after this election, because then they will realize what they have done.
The national coloured ballroom dancing champions, tutored by whites. It's a white identity they want, where they've always wanted to belong. A dance to the music of time, where only history stands still. Coloureds, blacks and whites will start voting tomorrow, most for the first time in their lives. It'll take 3 days, bombs or no bombs, committing South Africa to a multiracial future and consigning white domination on this continent to history. Peter?
Nations were also targeted in other blasts across the country. And if that is ominous, so is this. A white lorry driver shot dead, his body burnt by black radicals apparently bent on revenge. In Cape Town, President de Klerk addressed the last sitting of the white-dominated parliament with stern words for the bombers.
If these people were real men, they would come out into the open and discuss their concerns and proposals and not kill and maim innocent men, women and children. They have declared war on the rest of society. We will not rest until they have been tracked down, convicted and punished as they deserve.
To a rapturous reception this afternoon, Nelson Mandela arrives at a Johannesburg hospital where scores of those wounded in the bomb blasts are being treated. He toured the wards, offering words of comfort to the victims, many with serious injuries, and pledged that nothing would stop the elections taking place, certainly not the terrorists.
The madmen who are now slaughtering innocent people because they fear democracy.
Before departing, a spontaneous photo call and a powerful image. Harmony between black and white at a time when this country's racial fabric is severely threatened. Mark Austin, News at 10, Johannesburg.
The militant right-wing Afrikaner resistance movement said the bombings should not have come as a surprise. It denied any involvement, but said it was hardly surprising that the ANC was, as it put it, getting a dose of its own medicine. So are the attacks the beginning of a prolonged campaign of terror that could last beyond the elections? Our diplomatic editor, James Mates, reports from South Africa.
They warned they were preparing for war. Now it seems that for the most extreme of them, the indiscriminate bombing of civilians is to be a weapon in that war. They've been training hard, even training their children. But as the only major group not taking part in these elections, they are isolated and sounding increasingly desperate.
You must expect them to resist, and this is part of the resistance. I foresee that you're going to get more violence.
Armed whites tried open warfare in Bophuthatswana last month. The result, a humiliating defeat and 3 of their wounded men executed where they lay. But the widow of one of these men has told ITN that the AWB, who led this raid, have not been deterred.
They're very, very strong. People are scared of the AWBs. Because if they say they're going to do something, they do it.
What they've said they're going to do is violently disrupt this election. They deny the Johannesburg attacks, but their leader says the battle will continue.
No force in the world can stop people when they feel that that somebody is stealing their fatherland from them.
The problem may be that the force that should be stopping the far right, the police, is secretly helping it. The ANC is deeply suspicious of some elements in the security forces, the so-called third force, made up of men who still refuse to accept there will be black rule here.
They come from within the police force, and I think that many of the police are unwilling to act against their colleagues.
All but the most extreme of South Africa's whites will have been disgusted by these killings. They will also know the economic damage that a sustained bombing campaign could do. History shows that terrorists who operate without the support of their own community are rarely, if ever, successful. James Mates, News at 10, Johannesburg.
Have begun voting for the first time in the elections which are bringing to an end 3 centuries of white rule. Most votes will be cast tomorrow and on Thursday. Today, special categories like the elderly are having their say. Nelson Mandela, the ANC president, said this morning, "Today marks the dawn of our freedom." Nearly 23 million voters will be going to the polls. Each has 2 votes, one for the National Assembly, one for a provincial government. The election will be decided by proportional representation. People vote for parties, not candidates. There are 6 main parties and 21 smaller ones.
In Soweto this morning, applause for the first black voter in the township's history. 86-year-old Nelson Zamina is blind, but was determined to cast his vote for freedom. Outside, they queued in their thousands, the old and the infirm. They've lived through the misery of apartheid and could now act to end 3 centuries of white rule.
This day, it means that I must be free in everything. I must be free.
This is happy, very happy.
For thousands here in Soweto, this is their biggest day, and it's clear few have been deterred by the threats from the men of violence. 48 hours of bomb attacks and death aimed at keeping people away from the polls. Are people frightened to vote?
No, we are not frightened. Whatever happens, we are prepared to vote. Even if a bomb can come, we're going to sit here. We're prepared to die, but we are going to vote. Okay.
The ANC leader Nelson Mandela will vote tomorrow. He had this message to his supporters.
Now your day has come, because this election is about you. It is your election. It is your vote that counts. Years of imprisonment could not stamp out our determination to be free. We will not let a handful of killers steal our democracy.
Whites have also been voting. President de Klerk helped his 90-year-old mother to a polling station in Pretoria. He said the white extremists would be caught. And many moderate white voters seem resigned to the future.
I was never one for apartheid. As a matter of fact, I'd like to see the end of it.
Security near the township polling stations is intense, but the main problem this morning was administrative delays. Many voters had to wait hours for ballot papers to arrive before casting their vote. But vote they did, the start of 3 historic days that will change South Africa forever. Mark Austin, ITN, Johannesburg.
Hundreds of expatriate South Africans living in Britain have also been voting. 9 polling stations are open throughout the UK and in the Irish Republic. A short time ago, the veteran anti-apartheid campaigner Archbishop Trevor Huddleston cast his vote at the South African Embassy in London.
After decades of demonstrations outside South Africa House, this gathering was historic. The atmosphere, not one of protest, but an emotional gathering. Some had queued since the early hours.
I'm lost for words, to be sure. As I said, I couldn't sleep last night.
It's just great to be able to vote together.
A short time ago, the veteran campaigner Archbishop Trevor Huddleston arrived. A leg injury has prevented the 80-year-old from travelling to South Africa. This was the first time he's ever stepped inside South Africa House. He spent decades outside it, demonstrating. In the same place, 34 years ago, Trevor Huddleston became the biggest and most articulate voice of opposition to apartheid outside South Africa.
For the first time in this country,
His campaigning was relentless and tireless. It dates back nearly half a century. He left South Africa in 1956 to spearhead the international campaign. It progressed from street demonstrations to every facet of opposition to apartheid in sport and in trade. The Archbishop, who was stripped of his citizenship in 1976, was also a leader of the Free Mandela campaign. Today, in this carnival atmosphere, Trevor Huddleston cast the vote he's always dreamed about. And in 2 weeks' time, he hopes to be well enough to travel to Pretoria for the inauguration ceremony, when the former exiled Archbishop and the former political prisoner Nelson Mandela will be reunited. Andrew Simmons, ITN in Trafalgar Square.
We show everyone. With those words, Nelson Mandela urged the people of South Africa to defy the bombers and cast their votes. The outgoing president, F.W. de Klerk, said the new South Africa is being born. It will take 3 days for the whole country to vote. The first has been set aside for the elderly and infirm. There was no sign that the violence of the past 2 days was deterring them, and this morning passed off relatively peacefully.
It was the moment they'd been denied all their lives, their chance to have a say, to choose their leaders through the ballot box. Early this morning, in Zone 7 in Soweto, long queues formed outside the Church of the Resurrection. It's the first of 3 days of voting, a day reserved for the old and the sick.
I'm very happy about the election. We've been waiting very long.
I'm excited. I want to look forward for the new South Africa.
They were trying to make it easier for them to vote by giving them their own day, but it was a long, slow process. Election officials made sure it was all done fairly, but at this place at least there was no security. It had been promised after the recent terrorist attacks. Nelson Mandela, in a statement to the nation he is soon to lead, told them not to worry.
We will not let a handful of killers steal our democracy. Our surest way to stop them and to bring peace is to cast our vote. Let us vote in such overwhelming numbers that we show everyone how much we love our country.
Old people who couldn't get to the polling stations had ballot papers brought to them. These whites have always had the right to vote, but this was something very different.
So I was very excited. It raised my blood pressure.
I was very happy that we're doing the right thing.
President de Klerk took his 89-year-old mother to vote. He's expected to be vice president in a government of national unity after the election, an extraordinary transformation for a man once thought of as one of apartheid's hardliners.
Today, the new South Africa, which was our vision for such a long time, is being born. It's a good news day for South Africa and all its people.
Back at the Church of the Resurrection in Soweto, Adeline Melede was on her way home. She'd been the first in the queue.
Now's the time, now's the day. Never mind the bombings and things. They don't mean nothing. We are going forward.
At long last, political power in this country is passing from the hands of the minority to the majority. Even if Nelson Mandela finds it hard to keep all the promises he made during the campaign, the right to vote will change the lives of black people in South Africa forever. There is nothing the extremists can do that will stop that. They're still waiting patiently in the sun. This day was a long time coming. A few hours more won't make any difference. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Soweto.
Thousands of South Africans have also been voting at 8 polling stations here in Britain. The largest queue was at South Africa House in Trafalgar Square, for many years the focus for anti-apartheid demonstrations.
Trafalgar Square, scene of so many angry protests against the old apartheid regime, is today a place of celebration for the new South Africa. They've been queuing around the block outside the embassy, waiting in their hundreds to make their mark on the new democracy more than 5,000 miles away.
I think it's fantastic, you know. It's the first time after so many years, so we're really delighted, excited about it.
I think it's a very difficult thing to describe. There's only one way you can describe it, just by tears coming down your eyes, your cheeks.
About 60,000 South African expatriates, along with holidaymakers, students and business people, are eligible to vote here. So far, things have run smoothly overall, although official observers have been watching closely for irregularities.
It doesn't matter who's the person involved, as long as it doesn't continue.
The most distinguished visitor this morning was one of the world's foremost anti-apartheid campaigners, Archbishop Trevor Huddleston. For decades outside, he railed against the South African government. Now, for the first time, he has entered the embassy.
I'm confident that the people of South Africa will vote decisively for freedom. I hope that through the ballot box, all South Africans, black and white, will express their confidence in Nelson Mandela and the ANC and provide them with the mandate to head a government of national unity.
The Archbishop says this is a time for hope. Most people voting here today would thoroughly agree. Bill Turnbull, BBC News at South Africa House.